So I've been an assistant director at RPI for 13 years, not consecutively. I'm also a parent of 3 children, one who's out of college and 2 that are currently in. So I've been through this process both in work and in my life. And if you have any questions, it really is perfectly fine. Just throw up your hand, because if you have a question, there could be somebody else in the room that has the same question. How many of you have completed a FAFSA in the past? Okay, so those of you that haven't, look at the people who have their hands up. And those are the folks that when I'm gone from here and you can't remember my name, you can call on those people to say, hey, how do I do this? This is going to be an overview of the entire, it's pretty much financial aid 101. So beginning to end, everything you need to know about financial aid. So these are the topics we're going to discuss. This presentation is being recorded and it will be available on the website, so don't feel like you have to write everything down or take pictures or any of that. It'll be available for you. But we're going to talk about what financial aid is, all of the different sources, what makes up the cost of attendance, and you'll hear COA and you'll hear EFC, which is the expected family contribution, and people talk about the FAFSA, which is the free application for federal student aid. So does anybody know the cost for filing the FAFSA? It's free, exactly. It's the first F in FAFSA is free. We'll talk about some special circumstances, and the Css Profile is an additional form that some private institutions will require, and then we'll talk briefly about the net price calculator. So financial aid basically is any source of money that's going to help pay for a student's education. When we talk about the cost of attendance, there are direct costs, those things that are billed by the institution. Typically that's tuition and fees, and if you're living on campus, room and board. But there's other costs associated with going to school, and those are the indirect costs. Those are the personal and miscellaneous expenses. You need more shampoo, you need more laundry detergent, you want to go out and get a pizza. That's all built into the cost of attendance because we know it's costs that students will incur. The books are also one of those indirect costs. Not every school will allow students to charge their books, so that's another cost. And it can vary widely from one school to the other. If you're looking at someplace like Hudson Valley, the cost is significantly less than someplace that's in Troy like RPI. They're both in Troy, but costs can vary considerably. The expected family contribution is what the federal government has created as a formula in what they believe the family should be able to contribute towards their education. I have yet to find a family other than those whose EFC is 0 who got their EFC and said, yeah, that's about right. Most folks get the EFC and think, how could they possibly expect me to come up with that? There are 2 components to the EFC. There's the parent part of it and the student part. I only mention that because if you have twins like I do, they may not have the exact same EFC. They're usually pretty close because the parent contribution should be the same, but the student contribution can be a little bit different. So this is just another way of looking at how we determine need. We take that cost of attendance, or COA, we subtract what's calculated as the expected family contribution, and what you're left with is need. So that's what the financial aid can equal. Can equal, doesn't necessarily equal. There's different sources of financial aid. Some are based on need, some are based on merit or athletic ability or any other things that a student is bringing to the institution. Scholarships, grants, that's the money you don't have to repay. So that's free money. Typically, and we'll get into how these are defined, but then there's loans, which is considered financial aid. It does have to be repaid, but it is considered financial aid. And then there's work study or employment. So as I said, scholarships don't have to be repaid. Typically, they're awarded based on a student's merit or some skill or other unique characteristic. The grants also don't need to be repaid, but typically they are based on need. Am I going too fast? Okay, because I can fly through. I've done this presentation here in the winter when it's been snowing and we thought it might get canceled because of the weather. I've done it in the fall. I never thought I'd do it in the summer, but it seems like it's summer today. So we'll just keep on going. So loans, that's money that either the student and or the parent can borrow to help cover the expenses. A loan can be used to cover that expected family contribution. So as I said, most families don't get that EFC and go, oh yeah, that sounds about right. Most think there's no way I can come up with that, and that's where the loans can help fill in. Employment, if a student qualifies for federal work study, it's a job that they would have on campus and they'll receive their paycheck for the hours that they've worked. Most students use their college work study for those incidental expenses, the occasional pizza, the going to the movies, the other things. So where does all of this financial aid come from? The federal government. Here in New York State, there's state sources. There's also private sources, and sometimes organizations that you belong to may offer aid as well. And some employers offer tuition benefits for children of employees. So really the federal government is probably the biggest source of financial aid, and that's why the federal government has the free application for federal student aid. And all but loans of the federal sources are based on need. You do have to reapply each year using the Fafsa. So you fill it out this year if your child or the student is going to be going to school next year, and then you'll fill it out every subsequent year as well. So here are some of the common federal aid programs. There's the federal Pell Grant. Some schools, if they have a teacher's education program, have the Teach Grant. Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, sometimes it's abbreviated FSEOG, is usually tied to the federal Pell Grant, the work study, and then the subsidized and unsubsidized loans, those are student loans, and then the PLUS loan is a parent loan. The PLUS stands for Parent Loan for Undergraduate Students. So as I said, in New York State, we do have the New York State TAP Award. It's the Tuition Assistance Program. That's what TAP stands for. When you get to the end of your FAFSA, there is a link. It's kind of hidden. You really have to look for it. It has like 2 little red carrots sideways. But if you click on that, it'll take you out to the New York State application. There are some state funds that are awarded based on merit. Most are awarded based on need. It uses most of the information from the FAFSA, but there are additional residency questions that you have to complete that New York State TAP application. It will send the funds to the school listed first in New York State on the FAFSA. You can absolutely change that, but just keep that in mind when you're completing the FAFSA. The first school in New York State is who New York State Higher Education Services Corporation is going to assume the TAP is going to go to. Then there are private sources. I know the guidance office has probably lists and ways that you can apply for some of these other scholarships and grants. The application deadlines vary, but usually it's in the spring of the senior year. And now is a good time to start researching what's available and marking your calendar when the deadlines are, because missing a deadline could be costly. Again, as I said, some organizations that you belong to may offer scholarships or grants that you have to apply for, but if you belong to them, they already know you. It's not just a piece of paper or an application coming through the internet. It's something that they already know you, maybe they know the student, maybe there's a better connection there. And I know some of those scholarships are smaller scholarships, but really small scholarships do add up. You know, $500 might not seem like a whole lot, but it could be a book or two. It could be, you know, a trip back and forth to school if you're going someplace farther away. And then employers. I know some schools have employee benefits that will help in funding your children's education. And I know, like my son worked at Price Chopper, they have a scholarship. So even places where students are currently working, they should look to see, are there any kinds of scholarship programs? So now getting into the actual FAFSA, or that free application for federal student aid, I don't think they even produce it by paper anymore. So really filing electronically is the way to go. And I will show you the link on how you can get there. It's not as daunting as people might have you believe. The first couple of pages are really just demographic information. What's your name, social security number, date of birth. When it asks for your name, social security number, and date of birth, whose name, social security number, and date of birth do you think they're asking for? The students, exactly. It is the students' FAFSA. And I will get to a screen that will talk about the most common errors, but the most common error is that the parent is sitting at the computer filling it out, and where it says your name, they type their name, and it says your social security number, they type, and then you get to the end and you're like, oh shoot. And honestly, changing a social security number on a FAFSA is the hardest thing to do. So check it, double check it, call somebody else in to check it to make sure it matches and it is that student's. This is where every bit of information you report on that FAFSA is used in determining that EFC. So every college is going to use the same EFC, but every college's cost of attendance could be different. So that's where the need can vary based on the cost, even though the EFC is the same. You can file it at any point now for the 1920 academic year. So if you're here and your student is currently a junior, you probably don't want to file it until next October, but if you're here for somebody who's a senior, now's the time you can file it. It is going to be important that you meet whatever college deadlines there are. Some sources of aid get used up, and so you don't want to be after the deadline. You want to make sure you are before the deadline. So this is what it will look like when you're on the FAFSA webpage, and it is literally just fafsa.gov. The 1920 application is there. It's going to be using, the 2017 tax year information. So the reason to file electronically, there are good help sources. There's always a little circle with a question mark. If you're not sure what they're looking for in that answer and you click on it, it'll bring you out to the help. There's some skip logic that will ask you some questions and you can skip certain sections based on how you've answered them. And there is an option to use the data retrieval tool, or the DRT, where if you filed a tax return in 2017, you can retrieve that data electronically from the IRS. I have seen many FAFSAs where people took the time to retrieve the data, but they didn't take the final step to transfer it back to the FAFSA. And I'm not sure why that is, but it is an extra step. So it will take you out to the IRS. It'll say you're leaving the FAFSA. You say yes. You go out there. You have to use the same address you used on your tax return, and then it'll verify your information. It will bring the data back to the FAFSA, but you will not be able to see the actual dollar figures. It will just say transferred from IRS. So you can't check the figures. You just know that it came and it is correct. If you do it electronically, you can sign it electronically. There is a way to print the paper, sign it, and mail it. It takes about 8 weeks for the FAFSA to be processed. If you sign it by paper, it takes 3 to 4 days if you do it electronically. To sign it electronically, you just need an FSA ID. That stands for Federal Student Aid ID. Every individual reporting information on the FAFSA has their own FSA ID. So the parent has an FSA ID that they will use for any and all children that they're filling out a FAFSA, and every student has to have their own FSA ID. We talked about most of this. You don't have to use that IRS data retrieval, but if you do use it, it eliminates a lot of extra paperwork you may have to turn in if you're selected for verification. If your file is randomly selected for verification and you use the IRS data retrieval, you don't have to provide any income information. It's already been verified. So the FAFSA, as I said, is going to ask for the general student information, social security number, citizenship status, drug conviction. If you're male and 18, you have to register with the Selective Service. The student dependency questions, most parents who are filling it out, they're all going to be no. It's questions like, are you 24 years of age? Do you have dependents other than a spouse? Are you married? Are you a veteran of the U.S. Armed Forces? If you say no to all of those questions, then you would fill in the parent's information as well. So you're going to need your tax information and other financial documents. If you have any assets, whether it's cash savings and checking, CDs, mutual funds, you don't have to include any IRA or retirement accounts. You do have to report what you contribute on a pre-tax basis into those retirement accounts, but not what is held in your retirement account. Is there a question or? Okay. Just, if there is, just let me know. I don't know, you're being awful quiet and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It will also ask about dislocated worker status and, as I said, the assets from the student as well. So, yes?
Is there a certain amount of assets that we're allowed to have without it hurting the kid?
Absolutely. So there is an asset protection allowance in the formula. The dollar amount is tied to the age of the older parent. So as parents age, you are allowed to protect more of your assets. The parent's assets are looked at much more favorably than a student's asset. If you're looking just strictly at percentages, it's usually somewhere between 6 and 12% of a parent's asset that ends up being part of the formula, whereas it's 25% of the student's asset.
So car in a house where
Doesn't get reported. Your car, don't care. The house does not get reported on the FAFSA. It does get reported on the Css Profile. Yes?
For 529 plans, the owner often is the parent, the beneficiary, whose asset is
That is a fantastic question. I'm going to repeat it so that it's on the video. The question is, if there's a 529 savings plan, whose asset is it? Typically, it is the parent's asset, and it gets reported as the parent's asset, even if the student that you're filling out the FAFSA for is going to be the beneficiary. It's the parent. Now, if there's a grandparent who owns a 529, or an aunt or an uncle, it doesn't get reported on the FAFSA until those funds have been distributed to the student, and then they get reported in subsequent years' FAFSAs as untaxed income. Yes?
Now, when the parents are filling out the form, I'm assuming they want both parents.
So the question is, when parents are filling out the forms, it's both parents if they're married. If a parent is married to somebody other than the student's biologic parent, it's those parents. So whoever the parent the student lives with most, and his or her spouse, whether it's the biologic parent or not. The FAFSA does not ask information about non-custodial parents. It's just the parent with whom the student lived with most.
Both parents fill it out.
But both parents report information if they are still married. Is there another question?
If the parent lives with someone they're not married, and the father is not married.
So the question is, if the parent is living with somebody who's not a parent and they're not married to that person, they are not required to report information as a parent, but any contributions they're making towards the household are supposed to be reported as untaxed income. Any other questions? Okay. So it does require a signature from the student for whom the FAFSA is being completed, and if a parent is providing information, at least one parent has to sign. Well, there's only room for one parent to sign, but one parent has to sign. And by sign, if you have that FSA ID, that is your electronic signature. You don't have to print the page and send it off. It happens electronically. Yes?
So how do if we have a child that already is in college or whatever else, do we have to use that same ID?
So the question is, if I've filled out a FAFSA in years past for a different student, yes, that is your FSA ID forever and always, and it stays with you when you're filling out that student's FAFSA, the next student's FAFSA. If you went back to college and filled out your own FAFSA, it would be your FSA ID. It is always a good idea to create the FSA ID before you get into the FAFSA. Once you get into the FAFSA, there is a link when you get to the signature page. It'll say, do you need to create an FSA ID? And if you click yes, it'll take you out to the FSA ID creation page. They ask so many questions that typically the FAFSA times out while you're creating that FSA ID. There are 5 security questions. 3 of them you can choose from a drop down. 2 of them you have to make up a question that you can remember the answer to, and it's always going to be the same. So you can't put in who's my favorite child, what's my favorite movie, because those things change over time. It'll also ask you for a date that you can remember. It can't be your birth date, it can't be your kid's birthday, you know. So those are some things to keep in mind when you're getting ready. And having 3 children that I had to have complete the FSA ID, tell them it's going to take them an hour. It won't, but tell them it's going to take an hour, and that they're going to have to answer a lot of questions, but it's important and they have to get it done. I would also highly recommend, in some kind of secure way, you keep track of what you created as your username and your password, because I can guarantee a year from now when you're filling out next year's FAFSA, you won't remember it. I can't remember it. So keeping it someplace, you can retrieve it. Every person applying for an FSA ID needs a unique email address. So the parent and the student can't use the same email address. Do not have a student use their school email address, because next year when they can't remember their username and password, it's going to go to that email address that doesn't exist anymore because they're not in school anymore. So those are some things to keep in mind when you're creating that. Was there a question back there?
I think mine was, so before we even fill out the form, we should both get our IDs.
The question is, before starting the FAFSA, should I create my FSA ID? And I say wholeheartedly, yes. You can do it in the same night. It's not like you have to get the FSA ID and wait a week. You can get the FSA ID for both you and the student.
That's a separate web page or web address.
If you Google FSA ID, it brings you to the login screen. So, okay. So here are some of the most common errors. Number 1, that social security number being wrong is the most difficult to unravel and fix. So I know I have twins. Their social security numbers are exactly 1 digit apart, and I had each of them look at it. I had my husband look at it. I wanted to make sure I got it right. If parents are divorced and remarried, who fills out the FAFSA is probably the second most commonly made mistake. It's whichever parent the student lived with most in the last 12 months. There's 365 days, so technically they had to live with somebody more, but if you're not really keeping track of every day of the year, it's whoever if their student is living equally with both parents, it's whoever provides the most financial support, not emotional support, because we know those 2 things can be different, but the most financial support. So the income earned by the parent and step-parent if they're remarried, looking for that untaxed income. I can tell you, I did the FAFSA last year for my kids, and that question about what you contribute on a pre-tax basis to your retirement accounts is hidden. It is always missed because it shows up in a box where the top If you've transferred your data, it says transferred from IRS, and you think I'm golden, and you move on to the next page. But if you read beneath that, it has all of the untaxed income questions, and you do need to report. It's on your W-2, box 12, C, D, G, C, D, I don't know, it tells you exactly which line items from box 12. The household size, so for whatever household that student lives in, that's the household size. So if parents are divorced and the student lives with mom and she's remarried and stepdad has 3 kids, you're reporting on all of those people in the household. You're not reporting on the biologic dad and whatever family members might be in that household. It's the household in which the student lives. Same with the number of household members in college. If one student lives with this parent and his or her sibling lives with the other parent, you're only reporting the one who's in the household that you're reporting on in college. Other real estate and investments, the net worth is what you're reporting. So if you have a piece of property that you don't live in, you do have to report that. You can subtract if there's any mortgage against that property. Yes?
You said earlier that the financial information goes back to 2017. The kids in college, are they current or also 2017?
So all income information is going to look back to 2017. The asset information is as of the day you're filing the FAFSA. Yes?
If you have a child in college, you said, does that child count as in your household if they're already like in college?
As long as they will be, so the question is, do I count my son or daughter who's already in college right now when I'm filling out the FAFSA? They live in your household. I realize they don't live in your household when they're away at college, but they're part of your household and they will be in college for 1920. Yes, you report them as being in college.
I have a question. I'm a guardian and I'm a grandma, so I have to submit my W-2 form.
It's if there's a legal guardianship. So as long as there's a court order that you are the legal guardian, then it would be your, actually it's not your information. She would report that she's in a legal guardianship and that makes her independent.
So I would have to collect my own stuff then. That's dope.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yes.
If my daughter graduates in May, I can't put her down.
So if you have a son or daughter who's a senior in college this year and you anticipate they will be graduating in May and not going on to graduate school, you would not include them as the number in college. You may still include them as the number in the household if they're coming back and living with you, and but they wouldn't be in college for 1920. And you can change that if things were to change. Now, you know, if they decide to go on to grad school or, yes?
How do you report on pension?
You only report, the question is, how do you report a pension? You only report what you contribute on a pre-tax basis.
If you're receiving a pension?
If you're receiving a pension, if it's taxed, it falls into your adjusted gross income. If it's untaxed, you report it as untaxed income. And there's lines 16A and 16B. 16A is the taxable and 16A is the total and 16B is the taxable. So you can subtract to know what's taxed and untaxed. Yes?
I think you addressed it a few minutes ago, I didn't get it. So the parent gets a FAFSA ID number, and that's the same number that you use for all your children?
So if a parent gets an FSA ID, it belongs to the parent, and they use that same FSA ID for any and all FAFSAs they're completing, whether it's for other children or themselves.
What if you have misplaced it because it was years ago?
So if you had, it wasn't an FSA ID, I think it changed 3 or 4 years ago. So if you had a PIN way back when, and you go to create an FSA ID, it's going to look up your name, social security number, date of birth, and say, oh, you already have something there, and you'll be able to create your username and password, but your information will already be in the system. Yes?
Do both parents need an FSA ID or just one?
They don't both need an FSA ID. I can tell you my husband does not have one because he's like, financial aid, not me. So I've always filled out the FAFSAs. I've always used my FSA ID. If I were hit by a bus tomorrow, he would have to create one for next year's FAFSA because he doesn't have one. So one parent who's reporting information has to have the FSA ID, but they can both have one. And you can use them interchangeably. Yes?
For those of us with juniors that are applying October of year 20, is it 2018's reportable income then?
Correct.
2 years behind the year they are applying?
They call it prior year, and the reason they've done that is that you can now submit in October instead of having to wait until January when you haven't even gotten all of your W-2s and you haven't filed your tax returns and you don't know what you know what I mean? So they moved to going to the prior year, where by October of 2018, most people have completed their 2017. It's a rare instance that somebody has an extension beyond that. Yes?
I have moved since my 2017 taxes. Is that going to affect, is there a place to put that, or it's not going to match my address?
If you're doing the data retrieval, it will ask you your address. You have to use the address that the reported tax return used. So even though the FAFSA may have a different address, as long as you use the same, and it does matter if you typed lane on one and LN, it won't match. Or boulevard and you typed it out one place and not the other. So it just has to match exactly. Any other questions? So once you've completed the FAFSA, as I said, electronically it usually takes 3 to 4 days, and you'll be notified, or the student will be notified, whoever reported their email address on the FAFSA, of the student aid report, which is what the SAR stands for, and that will tell you the EFC. It'll say EFC, and there will be a digit. That is a dollar amount, even though it has 000, maybe 23. That means $23. If it's 00495, it's $459. So, and you can always get back into the FAFSA if you need to make corrections by using the student's username and password to view it online. The school will get an institutional student aid report. That's how every school you've reported on the FAFSA gets the data. It takes 10 to 14 days for schools to receive it, just based on data downloads. And when you get that student aid report, you want to review it for accuracy. It's also important to know that they're looking just for the dollars, whole dollars, no cents. I know the FAFSA doesn't make any sense, so they don't want cents. But if you report it, there's no decimal place. So if you include the cents, it's going to throw off your numbers horribly. So make sure you're just rounding to the nearest dollar. It really isn't going to matter if you round up or round down. Nobody's checking your math to see that it was 51 cents and you rounded down. It's not going to matter. But that's why we strongly encourage the use of that data retrieval. If you've found, when you get that student aid report back, that there were errors, you just log back in and you can update electronically, but you do have to wait until it's been processed. I know I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday who was trying to fill out the FAFSA, and she's like, oh shoot, I submitted it and I just realized I made a mistake. I'm like, well, now you gotta wait the 3 or 4 days for it to be processed, because you can't get in and make changes until it has been processed. So if you have special circumstances, now it's reporting the prior year's income, and as we all know, life doesn't always go and exactly the way we plan, and that your income isn't always exactly the same from year to year. So if there are any special circumstances, you can't report them on the FAFSA. You do have to send them directly to the financial aid office. You can create one generic letter and send it to all of the financial aid offices, but you do have to send it to them directly. Some things that financial aid offices can and typically will use as a special circumstance is if there's been a change in employment, medical expenses that are not covered by insurance. So you know, if you had a hospital stay and you have large bills. Change in the parent's marital status, any unusual dependent care expenses, and if a student were unable to obtain parents' information, they have to contact the financial aid office directly. So are there any questions about the FAFSA before we move on to the profile?
So if there was a special circumstances, are you just writing a letter and then you have to approve it later, or the last question?
So if you have a special circumstance, yes, you would write a letter or an email, whatever, and then the financial aid office may ask you for additional documents. If it was medical expenses, they may ask to see your medical bills. If it was a change in employment, they may ask to see a current pay stub. If it was a divorce, or they may ask to see the divorce decree. If unfortunately it happens, there's a death of a parent who reported income on 2017, they may need to see the death certificate. I know it sounds harsh, but unfortunately, the financial aid office has to document if they're making changes to the data. Yes?
So it's like within this month, we should be filling out this paperwork?
So you can start it at any point. Depending on the schools you're applying to, they have different dates. So if you're applying early decision or early action, you may have a November 15th deadline. If you're applying on a rolling admissions, there might be a different deadline. If you're applying what we call regular admissions, it may not be until February. So you definitely want to check with each and every school and meet the earliest deadline. Yes?
I just have a question. I've heard from somebody that if you do something early decision, the colleges might not give you as much financial aid. Is that true?
So the question is, if I apply early decision, I heard you may not get as much financial aid. I can only speak to our office's policy, and we award the same in the early decision applicant pool as we do in the regular admissions applicant pool. That's not to say it's the same at every.
It's like if you do early decision, they've got you. If you do wait, they're like, come on to our school, we'll offer you this.
So there is a certain amount of, there's early decision and early action. Early decision is binding. Those schools that offer early decision where it is binding, and I know my admissions colleagues, I hope they're not watching this, might say differently, but if you can't afford to go to that school, it's probably not the best decision to apply early decision, because you either have to say, yes, I'm coming, and withdraw all of your other applications, or if you can't afford it because the financial aid is not sufficient.
They say it's a friendly early decision. I mean.
I didn't know there was an unfriendly one.
That's what we were told.
So early action just means you get your information earlier, but you still have the opportunity to compare this financial aid to that financial aid. Personally, and I told my kids, you can apply early action any place you want. You cannot apply early decision because I need to be able to compare. We have to keep our options open. And you know, that was a personal decision. I can't tell others how to proceed. Yes?
A quick follow-up on having older kids in college. You said they count for the household. And is there a way in Fafsa where you report expenses you have for this? Let's say you cover tuition, cost of living. Is that part of the Fafsa?
So the question is, if you have an older child who's currently in college, how do their costs factor into the financial aid? And that's an excellent question. The EFC for the parent is divided by the number in college. So that's how it's calculated that you're having expenses for that other person in college. So parents cannot be a second in college. It has to be a dependent in the household. But if there's 2 in the household, the parent's contribution is divided by 2. If there's 3 in the household, each one is divided by 3. Okay, so the CSS profile. It's used by private institutions to determine their institutional dollars. Rensselaer does require the CSS profile. Many private institutions have done away with requiring the profile. There is a cost for filing the profile. It's $25 for the first school and then $16, I think, for every subsequent school. So only file the profile if that school requires it. If they don't require it, pass. It asks many of the same questions as the FAFSA, but goes into much greater detail. So the FAFSA is just going to ask for your adjusted gross income. The CSS profile is going to ask for all of the line items that made up your adjusted gross income. The FAFSA is not going to ask about your home that you live in, but they will ask about other real estate. The CSS profile is going to ask about the home in which you live and any other real estate. The FAFSA is not going to ask you what you have in your IRA or KEO or other retirement accounts. The CSS profile will ask you what you have in those accounts. If the school requires the CSS profile, you are obligated to answer all of the questions on the profile. If you skip them, then that financial aid office can't determine their institutional need-based dollars. I like to think of the CSS profile as the FAFSA on steroids, but there is a New York State shopping sheet. It was designed to make it easier to compare because every financial aid office will produce a financial aid award letter, and they will all look horribly different. I've been in financial aid my whole entire adult life, and I had to set up a spreadsheet so that my husband could understand what I was talking about when we were looking at our kids' financial aid, because the cost of attendance, what they offer in financial aid, and what the out-of-pocket cost will be is what the shopping sheet is designed to try and make more apparent. It's required in New York State, but it's not required in all states. So my kids are both in Massachusetts. They didn't get a shopping sheet. They did for the schools that they applied to in New York State. The net price calculator, every school who participates in the federal financial aid programs is required to have a net price calculator. It's not a guarantee. It is just a way of looking at a similar student and what they had to pay out of pocket in the last year or so. So it might give you a ballpark, but I wouldn't rule out any schools just based on the net price calculator. I also wouldn't say, oh, you can definitely go there based on the net price calculator, because awarding policies can change from year to year. If you input the data incorrectly, you can get an incorrect figure. So it's a guideline. It's a way to get an estimate to see, do we fall in the ballpark of being able to afford it? But it's not a guarantee. That is my presentation. So I will open it up to any questions that perhaps you have. Yes?
Is there a data retrieval tool for the CSS profile as well?
That is a fantastic question. Is there a data retrieval tool for the CSS profile? And the answer is no, which makes it even more complicated, because if you retrieve the data on the FAFSA, you can't see the dollar figures to then put them onto the CSS profile. So when you're filling out the profile, you actually have to pull out your tax returns and go line by line with the questions that they've asked. Any other, was I that thorough, or are you just that tired because it's so hot outside?
Quick comment. Thank you, Rochelle. Just for some of you who haven't done so, next Tuesday evening, we are having a Fafsa Workshop where you would make an individual appointment and meet with somebody from the higher ed corporation to go through your own FAFSA. So this would be a great kickoff tonight. If this weekend you set up your ID and then maybe even attempt the FAFSA, you could log in individually in our computer lab, and somebody from the higher ed will come in and say, oh, this is how you answer this question. We have a lot of different unique circumstances out here, and that would be a huge help. I know some of you have already done so. You would, if you haven't and you really feel you want someone to look at your FAFSA, call the high school number, 861-8591, extension 3000. If you don't remember all that, just ask for the counseling center, our office, And we still have some appointments available. So that's next week. I think we still have all times. It goes from 5 o'clock to 8 o'clock, about half-hour increments. Yes?
So once you start the application, can you stop and you
Yes.
save?
So on the FAFSA, you can create a save key. It's just a 3-digit code. You pick the 3 digits. And you can come back into the FAFSA a day later, a week later, a month later. Until you've submitted it, you can go in and make changes. Once you've submitted it, you just have to wait for it to be processed. But then you can still get back in and make changes if you discover there was an error. But by all means, you can start it at home, come in with that save key, and when you're here at that workshop, you can log in and you're already partway through. Wow, I've never had an audience that was so quiet.
Well, thank you. Join me with a round of applause for Rochelle. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will stick around if you have any questions that you didn't want to ask in front of the whole group. I'll be here for a little while, and you can certainly come down and ask those individual questions.
Perfect.